Hi, Misha here, and recently one of these came in the store. A Czech, previously Czechoslovakian, CZ-83. This is the commercial version in 9mm Kurz, 9mm Kurz if you prefer, 380, of one of the best comm block service sidearms really of all time, and a very forward-thinking handgun at that. Vz.82. The Vz.82 has a lot to offer, so since it's one of my favorites and was a very popular gun on the market for a long time, I thought we would talk about it, why it exists, how it improved upon its predecessors, and how it is similar and different to the commercial CZ-83. And that is correct. This is a Vz.82 CZ-83. Let's go back in time. Setting these aside, we need to go back really to before World War II for a second. The young nation of Czechoslovakia very quickly established itself as a preeminent maker of firearms. Of course, you had the Bren light machine gun and the Vz-24 rifle, which was a Mauser. There was also the Vz-24 pistol in 9mm Kurz, 380. And this gun here, the Vz-27 and 7.65 Browning. These would be the service guns of the Czechs before the Nazis would come, and the Nazis would continue production under their regime. A good little gun based on a Mauser factory design, single action only, with quite a unique safety, a semi-exposed hammer, but production would only last after World War II for a couple of years. Here we have the Vz.50. This is another 7.65 .32 caliber gun, and it was designed for police use and some military use. It's often considered a clone of a Walther PPK, but it's really not. For one thing, we have a frame-mounted safety. We have a double single-action trigger, and this does act as a decocker. Mechanically, it is very different from a Walther, although there's inspiration, we'll give it that. But that wasn't really enough for a true full-size military sidearm during the Cold War. Meet the Vz.52, the Vz.52 pistol. This started off as an entirely Czech design with prototypes in 1948 and 1949, but they were chambered for 9x19 parabellum, and they used a roller delayed system for the lockup. But after the socialists took firm control, it was demanded that the design be reworked to fire 7.62 by 25 Tokarev. So the prototypes for that chambering came out in 1951. A little refinement happened, and it was adopted in 1952. And the major production run would be from that time through 1954, and they'd build a little under 250,000. Single action only, firing the Tokarev round. The engineering behind this gun was creative, but frankly, it was a disappointment. Partially, it was because it was never meant to fire 7.62 by 25 Tokarev, rather different round by 9x18 parabellum, and it proved to just be a little thin in areas like below the chamber. And the decocker safety, 3 positions, kind of similar to that Vz.50, well, it had a habit of sometimes firing the gun when it was put in the decock if it wasn't in perfect repair. On top of that, the very long, narrow firing pin had a habit of breaking or otherwise becoming brittle with corrosion. Long story short, these required a lot of maintenance to keep going, and if the Czech military had its druthers, they would have been replaced long before they were, but because of the economics of the situation, they had to muddle along with the Vz.82 for several decades. But in the 1970s, things would start to change. CZ-75. First, the Vz-50 would get a cosmetic facelift, becoming the Vz-70 here, and there would be some transitional pistols too. New grips, a more ribbed hammer, trigger, different takedown, few modern techniques from manufacturing. It was essentially the same gun, just whereas this looks like something from the 40s or 50s, this one does have a bit more of a modern look and a slightly better grip. Mostly meant for police, military use some. But of course in 1975, the CZ-75 first appeared, not known as the Vz-75 because this was mainly for export. Chambered for 9x19 parabellum. This is a B model, pretty current, you know. This really put CZ on the map as far as handgun production, and they worked with the Browning system, 15 round or greater today, high cap mags, double, single action trigger. I mean, you know the CZ-75. Interestingly, very few Czech military units ever use this. Again, it was meant for export, not for their own use. That's because while this was chambered for 9x19 parabellum, that was not a com block round. No, the Russians, they really wanted the Czechs to stick it with the standard. And that gets us to these guns. The project began late 70s, early 80s, and actually progressed quite rapidly, hence the name Vz.82, because it was officially adopted that year and was in full production already by 1983/84, although full rate might have taken till 1985, really. And this was them learning lessons. The Vz.52 was an ad hoc thing, taking a design, retrofitting it to fire the communist cartridge. They learned lessons. And with the experience of export with the CZ-75, I think that gave them a lot of confidence. Now keep in mind, because of the whole communist situation and how trademarks worked, the factory at Brno was not able to really profit by this, but it gave them a lot of notoriety. And on top of that, there were a lot of firsts with the Vz.82, not just for the Czechs, but for military service guns and in general. First, let's compare it with its predecessor. This gun is just a hair under a kilogram. It's about 2.1 pounds. This gun is less than a pound. Now, to be fair, this is a larger gun, over 8.5 inches. This is much smaller, more compact than under 7 inches. And of course, 7.62 by 25 Tokarev is a very powerful round. This is chambered for 9x18. Now, to be fair, Seller and Belot, that manufactured the cartridges for these, didn't just copy the Russian 9x18 PM spec. They actually went to a new projectile, new load, and claimed that it was up to 20% more effective with about 100 meters per second higher velocity. So while it's not as powerful as Tokarev, it's more powerful than the Russian loading. On top of that, whereas this has an 8+1 capacity, this has a 12+1. Taking lessons from the CZ-75 magazine. They also learned something with that safety. Previous guns had that decocker. They got rid of it with the 82. In fact, you can't even put the safety on with the hammer forward. With the hammer in single action mode, you have a nice positive click, large, but still quite flush fit safety. So, a la 1911 style. Very simple, robust safety, showing lessons learned from this. On top of that, the whole gun is simple and robust. Very thick, nice barrel. Getting away from the thin chamber wall of this. It's all around better. Lighter, shorter. They still have kind of a similar finish. This has that gray paint that the Czechs are known for. With the Vz.82, we continue to use paint on the service guns, which is a great military finish, something that was very popular in the 1980s. So a lot of lessons learned there. So what about comparing it to the original Russian Makarov, the PM? Well, the PM, of course, has an 8+1 capacity, single stack magazine, heel mounted mag release. This, like I said, has 12+1 Browning style. The Makarov is slightly lighter, but not by much. Both are all steel pistols, but the Makarov's only 2-3 ounces lighter, and it's only slightly smaller than the VZ. Even though it's a double stack, the VZ grip is not especially wide. Of course, both are double single action. But the Czech gun has a much easier to use hammer, a wider trigger, and Makarov triggers can be inconsistent, let's say. Some are better than others, depending on the nation and wear and tear. I will say that the Russian gun does use fewer parts, larger parts. The Czech gun, more parts. These are very easy to disassemble, at least field strip, but going past that can be rather convoluted, more so than a Makarov. But the Czechs were known for making slightly higher quality guns. So with that, let's talk about some features that were just kind of all its own, frankly. Disassembly, it's very much like a Walther and thus a Makarov, with one twist. The trigger guard. Now, as it stands right here, you cannot pull it down. You need to eject the magazine, and then you can. Pops down like that, stays down. There's actually a small detent up in the mag well that needs to be pushed in and can't do with the mag still inserted. That's about it. Up and off. Sometimes your recoil spring will stay with your barrel. Other times it stays with your slide. Standard spring, standard slide. Again, for any of these kind of little blowback guns, couldn't be easier. Now the barrel is pinned into the frame, so you're not going to be taking it out for cleaning. And if you do go to put it back together, remember the whole trigger guard mag catch thing. Another lesson, of course, they learned from the Vz.82 was to give it a good, robust firing pin, and it is spring-loaded, unlike the Makarov, which is free-floating. They really did go all out this time. I don't think they wanted another lemon on their hands. And there are very few things to complain about with this gun. Of course, there are no perfect guns in this world. Witness holes in the back of the mag. But for its intended purpose of close-range self-defense that can be issued to a large army, CZ did a banger job here. I want you to keep in mind when this was introduced, 1982, with development a couple of years earlier. It is pretty standard blowback gun with a last round hole open, and an external release. Okay? Again, quite a nice trigger. It also has much larger sights than a standard Makarov, and this nice rib on top. It has finger rests, and that's really where it excels. The ergonomics really fit the hand quite nicely. Now, if you've noticed, this has an ambidextrous safety, as well as push button mag catch. It was actually the first standard issue full production military sidearm to have those two ambi features. In fact, the only thing that's not really ambi is the slide release. Very forward thinking, not just for a com block pistol, but for any military pistol whatsoever. Also very forward thinking in the barrel, this has polygonal rifling. Glock made it famous, but technically CZ got to the punch first, with this being the first kind of military gun to feature it. Although, of course, we have to give credit to HK for the various guns it used. They weren't the first to use polygonal, but kind of the first to see mass adoption by military. And there's pros and cons to polygonal. A story that I always oft repeat. It's always worth it, though. The first time when these came into the country, they didn't appear until after the end of the assault weapons ban, not the Vz.82s. And the first one I ordered, my friend at the gun shop actually sent back. He looked down the barrel, thought it was shot out, and sent it back. And I said, give me another one, because that's how they're supposed to look. So it took a couple of years for people to kind of adjust to that look. Like I said, 12+1 capacity mag. In fact, let's talk about the accessories these came with for a minute. Typical holster here, leather. They came with a spare mag, and there's a cleaning rod deep inside there. At first, this might seem like a pretty standard holster, but actually has one kind of neat feature. Like the pistol, it was designed with an eye towards being ambidextrous. Take a look. Here it is with the pistol on this side and the mag on this side and the cleaning rod where we saw it. That'll work. Buttons up. But if the owner operator needed it the other way, here you go. The mag goes in the other side, pistol the other direction, and even the cleaning rod. There's a loop on each side for the cleaning rod, and actually the pistol and mag use the same bottom part. This bottom part's actually divided with two pieces here, so you can insert the mag or the pistol either way. Neat for that day and time. Just that thought towards being ambidextrous was forward thinking for any military, especially a com block one. These were vastly more popular than the Vz.82 and cheaper, easier, more economical to mass produce. They were a hit within the Czech military and police, and that led CZ to do this here. Tasting success with the CZ-75, and since the Vz.82 had been so good in the military, the Brno factory would quickly produce the CZ-83 here. The commercial/export version. And there are a few minor differences we'll talk about, but basically the exact same gun. And while the CZ-83 could have been purchased with the Makarov chambering, in reality, very few of those were made. Instead, most were in 9x17 curves, 9mm short, 380 Browning. Still a very popular cartridge. Those had a 13+1 capacity, making them one of the earliest double-stack high-capacity guns in that chambering, alongside Beretta's 84 offering. They also had a version in 7.65 32 Browning, and it had a 15 round, 15 plus 1 capacity because of the smaller cartridge. I've actually had one of those before, but it was really before we did the YouTube channel, so oh well, and I don't have one today. Again, these were for export, not really for military use, maybe police use. Again, mostly for export though. But we do have a few differences between the two pistols. For one, the 82 primarily had a paint type finish, military type finish, with some parts being blued. The 83 was a pretty much all blued gun, and it was also offered from the factory with a nickel finish. Makes sense. There were also variants of this, namely the 32 Auto, but maybe some 380s too, that had a squared off trigger guard. This one doesn't, has the same as this one, but there was a small variation in the trigger guard as well. Of course, the markings would be different. And the 82 here, it has a lanyard ring at the base of the mainspring here. And the 83 simply has a round plug there. In theory, you could put a lanyard in there, but it didn't come with one. And there's also a difference in the magazines themselves, aside from caliber. Note that this one has a stamped, a thin floor plate. And this one has a flat, thicker floor plate. Now, later production 82 mags also had the stamped floor plate, pretty much inspired by the 75. So that's not really a change in the caliber, but something worth pointing out that changed in production of the line in general. The military production 82s would run from 1983 through 1992. However, the CZ-83 line would run from 1983 all the way up until 2012, when CZ USA finally announced their discontinuation. So with that, let's talk about importation and use within the USA. And there, actually, the CZ-83 came here first. Some were brought over in the mid/late 80s from Czechoslovakia. But they were new production guns, but they were very uncommon, at least in my neck of the woods. I only recall seeing a couple. They came in a box with 2 mags. Again, most all were in 380. I think in theory there might have been some Makarovs brought in, but I could be... They honestly wouldn't shock me if there were none. And of course there were a handful of 32s. But 380 was the predominant thing. And again, this was sold as competition to the guns like the Beretta 84 and was kind of represented as the little brother of the CZ-75. And while uncommon, they were relatively well respected. And like I said, production would continue after the Czechoslovakian nation fell apart, becoming the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And CZ would continue to manufacture these under its new name and all that, bringing them over in small batches to, like I said, 2012. So just shy of 40 years, or wait, 30 years, I think. Time. Yeah, 30 years after their introduction. The 82, on the other hand, a little more interesting. The military Vz.82 would not appear here, at least in any numbers of note, in mass import until 2005. And there were 2 reasons for that. For one, they served in the Czech military until that time. They were not replaced until the 21st century, because while it was firing 9x18 Makarov, it was that Celer and Belot loading of it. It was sufficient. Keep in mind, too, that the Czech Republic and Slovakia continued to use their Cold War era Vz.82 rifles as well. Vz.82 pair. Good. Held open. So yeah, if they were going to hang on to their rifle, eventually finally being replaced in 2011 by the 805 Bren, it's no surprise that they hung on to their pistols until modernity. So that was reason one. They just weren't being surplused. Even the older ones that they were ready to sell, well, they weren't going to bring them over because of this magazine. Up until September of 2004, the federal assault weapons ban would not have allowed this evil 12-round magazine to come in. And the Czechs are quite adamant that it wasn't worth their time to make a new mag or rework these to only hold 10 rounds. Perfectly logical. But after the end of the assault weapons ban, these were allowed in, and it was a good time because they were being surplused out, and they came in. And at first they were about $300, although as time would go on, deals would get better and better. You could pick one up for $199, with usually 2 mags, and spare mags were not a thing. So this was a very popular gun after maybe a bit of a slow start because $300 was a perceived high price point in 2005. But say by 2007, $200, $250, didn't seem so bad. Plus, something else changed that really bolstered these up. In February of 2007, the ATF approved these to be CNR. That's because a museum requested it. They looked it over, and since these were built in a country that no longer existed, Czechoslovakia, and they were considered to be primarily of historical collecting importance, they were given the A-OK to do that. So that meant anyone with a CNR license in FFL 03 could pick one up. And so, considering a lot of them were in really good shape, it was a double single action gun with a good safety. Not my favorite, I'll be honest, but good. And a 12+1 capacity. That ended up being a lot of people's carry guns, because around that same time, 2008, 2009, conceal and carry, CCW, became more and more popular in the USA. And while I never would encourage someone to buy a surplus gun with an unknown history and unknown round count for carry, for a lot of broke college students, it was a good option. Certainly better than the P64 at least. But this became a vastly popular gun for years until finally most all of the surplus guns had been sent over. And now prices are climbing up again. This is my original one I bought in 2005. And it's always been a good shooter. It's a very comfortable gun. It, along with my Polish P83 Wanad, are probably my favorite Makarovs. And that's why I felt like talking about this CZ-83 when it came in the shop. Because this is really one of the best personal defense, close range military guns of the 1980s. Also, here in 2022, the Vz.82 I wouldn't say made headlines, but cropped up again when the Czech Republic donated about 30,000 to Ukraine. So, they didn't have a whole lot left that had not been sent over anyway, and so now those, plus whichever ones were already there, are over there, which makes perfect sense, because even though these were intended for the Cellar and Belot 9x18 cartridge, they will fire Russian/Ukrainian loadings perfectly well. In fact, these are not very ammo sensitive. And that's about it. One other thing that kind of comes to mind, as I said earlier, the Vz.82 has polygonal rifling. The 380 CZ-83, it has standard lands and grooves rifling, which if you're reloading or using lead might make it a little better. Just thought I'd mention that as we get to the end here. But it really is just a great Makarov, and I think it changed a lot of people's minds about guns from the Comblock era. It was kind of part of that trend of making people realize that factories over there really did make some damn good guns. And Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, great representatives of that. So with that in mind, I thought giving this a dedicated video was worthwhile. So I'm curious, anyone out there still conceal carry a Vz.82 or even CZ-83? Again, a few years back, that was a popular thing to do. And I will warn you, if you plan on refinishing one, you can do it, but there are some small pins and springs in the frame part, that can definitely give you a headache. But be forewarned of that, and you should be fine. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.